we need to kind of realize that property is not necessarily a silver bullet, and B is necessarily the best investment asset.
Assalamu alaikum, Tanvir. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm really excited to be here with you, Shaheen. Thank you so much for having me.
Tanvir, first, could you introduce yourself to the audience so that we might get to know you better?
Yeah, absolutely. I am the founder and CEO of Wholesome, which is a purpose driven investment company. We offer Sharia compliant and ethical investment options, and we have aspirations to provide a whole range of other wealth management and money management tools for customers globally.
This is great. This is my first founder that I have in the show. I'm very excited. And in surplus, since in the halal investment space, a booming space, I'd rather say. What inspired you to launch a startup, you as a person in the halal investment space, and why in Australia?
Yeah, I probably feel very inadequate that I'm someone doing this, but basically it's because no one else was really playing in the space with the same sort of products that I wanted to launch. And I had too many people, friends, family, acquaintances in the Australian community that wanted investment solutions that were Sharia compliant and that offered something new, something that was not available in the current market. I started scratching my head thinking, okay, what have I worked on? Who do I know? How can I put it all together? And I felt that, alhamdulillah, I was in a privileged position that I studied in Islamic finance. I worked with a lot of different investment partners. I had a legal background, so I could get up to speed around the compliance and regulations. And then lo and behold, I put it all together and said, Bismillah, let's have a go. And here we are.
This is amazing, and we wish you the success you deserve because taking the entrepreneurial leap is such a gigantic step. We'll get back on more on this because I would like for you to inspire our youth and just active professionals. One thing is that how would you compare the halal investment market in Australia to other countries, maybe in the Western Hemisphere? How would you assess the maturity of this market?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the reasons that I started Wholesome was because in Australia we have very limited options. This is not just in the investment space, it's across personal finance, business finance, insurance, you name it. Australia is a very young market for Islamic financial services. But
Mhm.
the good thing is that it's now reached a point of maturity and scale where new services can be launched. So, one of the things as an entrepreneur is obviously identifying a market gap, but also working out if there is a scalable market opportunity. And so, Australia now has about 1 million Muslims. And beyond just the Muslim market, Australians are increasingly demanding more ethical and values driven financial services. So, I am definitely conscious that I'm not just about servicing the Muslim community. So our branding and product development has been designed to be accessible to the broader Australian population. So we definitely tap into a wider market than just Muslims. So Australia is definitely young. We have a few products and services, but we're lacking in some of the key, I would say, infrastructure or ecosystem poles that are necessary. So, for example, we don't have an Islamic bank. The regulatory framework hasn't been developed in an encompassing way to support Islamic finance that has already been done in, for example, the United Kingdom or in many of the European markets. So, we somehow are trying to create interim solutions until we have a proper product. So, for example, without having a bank, we do not have deposit insurance for people's savings inside a financial institution. So that's one of the major gaps. We also don't have a lot of opportunities to park money for a short term where people can get a regular income out of that. And that limits the ability to create financial products that need short term solutions. So we have a few gaps there. The other thing is we have a talent gap. And this is something that I'm trying to encourage more people to. And I mean, I didn't start my career in finance, but I ended up working in finance because there weren't too many people who had a background in Islamic finance. The talent gap, the regulatory gap, and then the product gap, things that kind of are holding back the community. But inshallah, I'm hoping that I can obviously do my little bit, but we as a community can inspire more entrepreneurs to fill those opportunities here in Australia. And then likewise, we can kind of learn from and partner with entrepreneurs and institutions in other countries. So I was recently in the US and I learned a lot more about what's happening in Canada and the United States. And I'm trying to see if we can collaborate more with people who are far more established to help our small community in Australia.
This is amazing. And I think it's great that you're talking about the talent gap
Yeah.
because last time I was listening on a podcast where they were saying, would you recommend for the youth to go work in like pure finance so that you know how is the system designed, how are the infrastructures, how big is institutions work, so that you can also then bring your halal added value, but also with your background from like very big institution finance companies, so you can blend the two and come up with something very qualitative. What do you think on this? Do you think it would be good for our talent to prepare them to go in those big corporations like Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and so on, so that they can be more geared up for the future in maybe the halal investment space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I would encourage people to gain all the necessary skills and go to the right places to get them. It's a bit of a catch-22 situation for our community because we need more Islamic financial services, but at the same time, we don't have enough organizations that can train the talent that can provide that. So, in that
Yeah.
absence, we do need people who have experiences in conventional institutions to come and contribute. This creates a bit of controversy because a lot of people might not want to participate in the conventional sector because it goes contrary to their values. But I think that we're not going to be able to build an industry fast enough if we don't have more talent. And so, go and spend a few years, gain the skills, and then come back and contribute. And I think that's the most effective way we can build the talent gap or close the talent gap rather.
This is great. Tanvir, I love how you go straight to the point. I love this. So, Tanvir, about your background, you work at an Islamic bank before in the Islamic finance industry. You also work at McKinsey. I think it might serve you a lot now, all the insights you gained past. What key insights would you take from your experiences? What serves you the most?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's probably three things to say. Two of them are insights, and one of them is about a skill set. The first insight is that any good entrepreneurship requires having a very clear strategy and being able to execute on that strategy. I saw that good strategy can make the difference between a successful company or one that's leading the pack and one that isn't. And so that's something that McKinsey, we learned a lot about and we worked a lot on strategic projects. When I started Wholesome, I needed to have a very clear strategy. I initially was like, okay, I want to solve wealth management, but that's not a strategy. That could be a vision, it could
Yeah.
be a very big dream. But a strategy requires one to work out, okay, where can I play and where can I play with something that is of value that I can scale long term success. And the thing I realized about the halal investment landscape is there we didn't have enough solutions that was focused on the short term. So we needed to provide a service where someone can park their money for maybe up to 12 months, have their investment maintain relatively a stable value, so not fluctuate on a say a weekly or
Yeah.
daily basis like a stock market investment or a cryptocurrency. And thirdly, provide a regular income. So this is something that was available to a lot of people in the general community. So people can use fixed term deposits, people can invest into treasury bills, people can invest into fixed income assets in credit funds. We didn't have any of that for as Muslims in Australia. And I believe based on my trips in Southeast Asia and Europe and North America, generally a lot of the Muslim market do not have enough fixed income products. So I realized that if I want to provide a new investment service, I need to play in a space that not many people are playing in, and which I can be a first mover or offer something compelling and try and grow from there. So that was number one of our strategy. The second thing I gained from my time at the Islamic Development Bank is that emerging markets provide incredible opportunities to invest and grow that are perhaps attractive from a return perspective and provide a natural hedge against the fluctuations in the US market, the European market, or the Australian market. So a lot of these major advanced economies tend to move in a very similar pattern. Europe less so, but in Australia, a lot of people were mainly investing in Australia or the US. And what I saw was the Middle East, Southeast Asia, even many of the emerging, fast growing African economies in places like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, they weren't necessarily correlating or moving in the same way as what's happening in the US. And so the insight I gained is why aren't we investing into these economies? It makes no sense. It's not to say you put all your money into those economies,
Yeah.
but if we diversify, we can ride any major market fluctuations or bear market situations. That to me was a no-brainer that as you know, we think about the ummah, right? And that we have a global humanity, and yet our financial services were not reflecting that. The portfolios of some of the major Islamic funds or fund managers were tended to be very limited to a stock market in advanced economies. And then the third point I'll share from my experiences was that there is a sort of fine set of skills that combines being very technically competent or being able to run your numbers and your modeling at the same time being able to communicate very briefly and very top down. This is a skill set that my managers drummed down onto me all the time at McKinsey and at the Islamic Development Bank. We had to communicate to stakeholders, and something that now I'm appreciating because I have to be able to communicate very concrete numbers because people at the end of the day care in finance, they care about numbers, they care about understanding returns and risk, but also being able to communicate in a very logical fashion that, okay, A leads to B leads to C. This is something that, you know, McKinsey, we learned a lot about, particularly at top down communication and how logic flows. So I would say that in any type of entrepreneurship, we need to break it down into what are the key skills. So, what is your strategy? What are the markets you can play in? Where are the new innovations you can bring that's outside what everyone else is doing? Because you don't want to just be repeating what everyone else is doing. And C, being able to communicate that in a very clear and logical manner. Those are sort of three things that I've gained from my experience that I'm applying and constantly trying to build upon and get better at.
I think it's so interesting and you covered so much ground. Here, I wanted to know more about this entrepreneurial journey with Wholesome. Instead, what has been your achievement so far? How, because we're talking about strategy, I'm with a McKinsey ex consultant. I need to talk to you about this. What has been your growth since you started this journey, and what is the vision for the future for Wholesome?
Yes, first of all, strategy, the fixed income short term investment space, that has resonated very strongly. And it's resonated not just in the Australian market, but it's resonated in other markets that I've had contact with and visited, Southeast Asia and the US most recently. And that's because there is, you know, when someone looks at their investment pie, so if you think about if I have $100 that I'm investing, to make it simple, I'm not going to put all of my $100 in just long-term investments, or I'm not going to just put it into highly volatile assets like stock market or ETFs or crypto. I'm always going to need some defensive assets, assets that have maintained their value and that they continue to pay returns through different market cycles. This is where Wholesome has really fit in, and people really understand that. I don't currently have a defensive asset, or I don't have assets that are providing me with a regular income. I'm just investing for long term growth. So, alhamdulillah, that strategy is paying off. It's meaning that I'm able to serve investors who are very sophisticated and have already investing in stock market or into property. I'm able to say, great, let me fill that gap that you've had. You've got your other strategies, but here's
Yeah.
something that's fixed income and defensive. So it helps them. And it's also been, interestingly, by Allah's mercy, I've been able to serve customers who don't really invest, who don't really have any sophisticated investment strategies. This is a stepping stone for them to get started because A, they realize that our fund is very short term, so they're able to liquidate and redeem their funds after 6 months because we only have a 6 month lock in. And also, they're really excited by and appreciative of the fact that we're paying monthly profits. And so now they have an investment that's actually helping them with cost of living, to deal with inflation, and to actually start preparing for other investment strategies that they might take. So I'll give you an example. I've got an investor, it's a husband and wife team. They invested $50,000 because they want to purchase a home in the next 12 to 24 months. They did not have any other place that they can invest in where they can get a competitive return, paying
Okay.
monthly so they can actually get a compounding effect, and they'll be able to pull out their money to go and buy a home. So this is a sort of realization that the strategy is paying off, and we started to get a bit of product market fit. And so that's been important to constantly revise our strategy. But also, now that we know that the strategy is working, we are redoing our communications. How are we going out and marketing to customers? And this is important. And as a founder, as an entrepreneur, we need to constantly listen to our customers like this couple. And so now I'm able to go back and offer that in different ways to customers who are like that.
This is awesome. I can guess. I can see that you're very driven, Tanvir. I wanted to know
I must
also
say,
that.
I'm not going to take all the credit because my customers are teaching me. I'm just playing the vessel. They are teaching me and helping me learn to how to best serve them.
Of this. You mentioned like the housing market in Australia, whether Canada, UK, or even the US in some extent, because the federal bank has raised the interest, so the housing market is getting very tense. We see that there's a massive problem in our community, and I talk to even my friends and I. We talk about halal investment, and there is one big thing. It's the real estate that we want to acquire property, but this is where our values are very important to us, and there is things we know we count a lot on halal investment to come at one point and save us in regards to providing like a deposit, even more than that. For instance, in Canada, some companies provide already are developing solutions that are at the beginning of the cycle
Mhm.
to develop financial structures to help Muslims acquire property, because otherwise we'll be maybe a bit behind on this aspect. What do you think should be done? Do you think there's still road to go, for instance, in Australia, but also since you have a global experience now? What do you think is still need to be done?
Yeah, great question. It's a very important topic and quite a complicated topic to kind of tackle. But I'll make a couple of comments. One is, first of all, I think we have perhaps placed too much emphasis on property as a key to wealth generation or as a sure investment strategy. If I provide one example, if you had invested into the S&P 500 and you took advantage of dollar cost averaging, so you put in a little bit maybe every month or every quarter, you would have generated far more wealth than if you had invested in property. And that's in most property markets, whether in Canada, Australia, US, even though that these markets have had a very hot property market. So we need to kind of realize that property is not necessarily a silver bullet, and B is necessarily the best investment asset. It makes sense for the vast majority of people. I'm not denying that. But there are people who are very well able to generate extreme wealth without necessarily investing in the property market. I think we need to have a healthy appreciation or skepticism of exactly property and where it plays. And particularly now where the cost of financing is so high, the risk reward appreciation of property is much different than it was maybe a generation ago. And the problem is
Yeah.
a lot of the advice is handed down from the previous generation where property prices were not as high and the cost of financing wasn't as high as it is today. So I think that's one point to make, which is we need to think about it from a rational and logical perspective. Number two is the property financing landscape, particularly from an Islamic land perspective, majority of home financing solutions outside the Muslim world have been borrowing from conventional sources and packaging them into Sharia compliant structures and then
Okay.
providing them to our Muslim customers. Now, the scholars have allowed that to happen because there's a supply demand mismatch. We don't have enough community capital to meet the demand. So the supply to the demand for home financing is not enough. And that's because we don't have a lot of Islamic banks. We don't have a history of Islamic banks. And we don't have a history of Islamic asset managers that provide financing for homes. If you think about it, home financing is typically 20, 30 years. We need asset managers with a lot of capital and a long track record to be able to meet the demand. So scholars have allowed the home financing companies to source from conventional sources that might not be halal, but as long as the final customer contract follows the tenets of Sharia rules and regulations and the various different contracting frameworks that scholars have approved. So we have a major problem here. Now, these solutions have been band aid, I would say, because they meet the immediate demand need, but they don't solve
Mhm.
the broader ecosystem solution where we need to have our own funding sources. So I
Yeah.
believe, and something that we are trying to work towards at Wholesome, is we need to create more fund managers that have more capital that can provide the home financing solutions. Tech revolution has really accelerated this. My background prior to Wholesome, I worked at a fintech called Bright. Whilst we were not working in the home financing space, we were working in the consumer financing space, but it was the same sort
Okay.
of concept. We developed warehouses which had investors put money into, and then using the warehouses, we provided financing to customers. When they made repayments, it went back into the warehouse, and we just kept refinancing the warehouse and getting bigger and bigger until we sold the warehouse capital as a bond. And this is what's known as securitization. We can do that for Islamic finance, and there aren't too many players working in the space, but something that I think we need to do. We inshallah hope to get there in a few years. We're not there yet, but I believe the pathway is there. And then the last comment I'll make is this is a bigger problem than just the Muslim community because it requires innovation to really solve. Not just sorry, it's a bigger problem than just the Muslim community, but it's complete supply chain problem. We have shortage of property builders. We have a
Yeah.
shortage of greenfield land, raw materials, and we have to think about the sustainability angle in terms of using sustainable sources and how we consume energy. So this is, I would say, a multi-pronged problem that requires many people to work together. I think so far most people have just said, "Oh, it's a financing problem," but I think it's a whole supply chain problem, and so we need new solutions and also new ways to think about housing. Is it sustainable that everyone wants to have a quarter-acre block of land and going to build a freestanding home? Or do we need to think about multi-use mixed housing kind of structures as well? So this is why it's a topic that's broader than this, but it's going to require us to work across many different industries and sectors.
This is brilliant. Honestly, this is so insightful. I learned so much things from you. It's so good. I wanted to know also, since you talked at the beginning, you mentioned how maybe sometimes you need to calculate right. Maybe property is not the right choice. Maybe investing in long term versus ETF or stock like you mentioned, the S&P, might be the better option. I think you know that beyond your cape of being a CEO and founder, you also have the cape of having the tremendous task of raising the culture, because you face our community is not as mature as just the regular folks. We need to educate people. How do you tackle this problem? Because this is your current customer base, but also your future customer base.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
how do you tackle this?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is something that I feel very passionate about. I was not a finance guy. I studied arts and law in my undergrad, and then I went
No
into the
way.
world of finance. I feel that I was privileged to get some of this knowledge. I am aware of the need to create more content to educate the masses. So there's a couple of things I'm doing. One is I share a lot of content on my social feeds, particularly in LinkedIn, to try and direct people, inspire people, share stories, share examples. Number two is I conduct a lot of community seminars and I do these events both in Australia but also globally. And I try and share a couple of messages. One is I first of all try and encourage people to invest, like get into the investment game, doesn't matter how little. Number two is I try and convince people that profit is not the only consideration. We need to think about many different things. One is, of course, risk, liquidity, but also something that I think is really important. Again, being a values based and mission driven organization, we need to think about sustainability. We need to think about is our investments doing positive things for the world or is it causing harm, particularly from a climate, human rights, social impact angle? So that for me is really important. I think that's comes from in the truth. For me, I entered Islamic finance not because it's just about let's tick a halal box. I came into it because the value was about how do we enjoin the good and forbid the evil, and that's across not just okay we forbid haram industries and riba and ghara, so that's interest and speculation and unreasonable risk, but it's also about how do we safeguard the environment and society. So for me, that content, sort of sharing the content through seminars is important. I do a lot of podcasts and talk shows like I'm doing with yourself, where I try and share and spread to a wider community as well. But that's not enough. We need to do more. I'm trying to also create more articles and generate more sort of content through that as well, and collaborate with other people who are like-minded in that aspect. And I think there's a growing community who are interested in that, both within the Muslim community but also outside the Muslim community. So I regularly collaborate with people outside the Muslim community because, again, this is beyond just the Muslim community. We, as a global
Yeah.
world, human civilization, need to safeguard our environment and societies, and financial services have a big role to play in that.
This is amazing. Thank you so much, Tanvir. And I will drop the link of Tanvir's LinkedIn on the description of the show so that you can reach out, follow. I follow him. He publishes article daily. Sometimes I see it almost multiple times a day. And I think it's very insightful, but also very inspiring, Tanvir. I have to say, when I see someone like, I think you were doing like a Harvard type of conference recently,
Yes.
and I saw this, I was, this is what I need to see. I need to see my community, my people doing these type of events, inspiring others. This is, I thought it was really good. Tanvir, I wanted to drop a little question on, you mentioned halal and how our community is also have their skepticism. They're a bit fearing the financial industry. I wanted to know something more in depth that relates to your startup journey on the spiritual side of things, because we know that the high investment space does not just touch the Muslim world, it's also ESG type of investing. But like on the spiritual side, how did your personal values, Islamic values, shaped your journey, your entrepreneurial journey in particular, and also I can see that even if it was not halal investment, you would have had started something because I can see you are driven. You would have started another startup. Why, in particular, the halal investment space?
Yeah, no, sure, absolutely. So let me answer that question by sharing a story. My first role in finance was not really a finance job, but I had to think about deeply the access to financial services. And that was, I worked for the Clinton Foundation, President Clinton from the US. He had a foundation that had a partnership with Unilever to try and source a couple of key commodities that they require in high volume in their supply chain. One of them was
Mhm.
coconut sugar in Indonesia. I traveled around the country to meet with farmers, and because we were trying to develop supply strategies, but also understand what are their challenges, how do we actually build an enterprise through this. I met one farmer I remember that really stuck with me. He was in a very remote part of an island that's connected to Timor Leste. It's called Rote Island. And I saw that these farmers were receiving much lower as a price for the product that they were selling to the traders. And that's because the trader was implicitly charging an interest because they had provided loans to them at the beginning of the harvest season. And so they were getting very little margin, but they were
Yeah.
locked into these long term contracts. So essentially, it was a form of modern slavery, in my view,
Yeah,
because
definitely.
they were in long term debt to the traders that they sold to. And as I researched and read more about this, I realized a lot of the world's agricultural commodities that we take for granted, cocoa, coffee, even fresh fruits and vegetables in some countries, are supplied by smallholder farmers with the majority value taken by traders and middlemen. And a little bit of finance was all it would take for them to free themselves from that debt and to be able to send their kids to school, buy inputs like fertilizer and pesticide and seeds to at the beginning of the plantation season that they can sell in the harvest. I realized that this is the essence of what the Islamic finance philosophy is about. How do you provide capital? You share risk, you be compassionate, and you let people innovate drive business, and you share the prosperity with all the different participants. That idea of risk sharing. And so that's what threw me into the world of finance, because I thought this is essentially the community values that I grew up with around what Islam is to me is now manifest in a very technical, legal way through the laws of finance. So the values we grew up with, community, shared value, caring for
Yeah.
humanity, this is a way that we can actually practice it. And interestingly, this is the very way that the conventional finance system is not practicing those values. It is about
This is awesome.
exploitation, it is about taking advantage of people, and ultimately, no one cares about where you get your food and where do you get your money and how it's used. So that threw me into that world. Now, why did I end up in finance? To be honest, finance didn't have to be it, as you exactly said. It could have been any other industry. I had a previous experience working with, well, a few different experiences working with NGOs. I honestly thought that I was going to work for a charity organization and spend my time trying to deliver aid and distribute resources to people that are very vulnerable. And what I realized with the charity sector was that they do amazing work, no doubt, and they play a very important role in society. And we know that sadaqah and philanthropy, these are important principles. We have zakat, of course, as a compulsory tax. But what I
Yeah.
realized was so much of the charity space is very band aid, very short term. It's not systemically solving these problems.
Yes.
When we are consuming chocolate, if we are buying chocolate from supply chains that are exploiting children and keeping cocoa farmers in poverty, no amount of charity is going to fix it. We are the problem. We can't then be a problem and then try and solve it by giving a bit of breadcrumbs as charity. But if we develop sustainable entrepreneurship, sustainable supply chains, and we use capital to mobilize that change, we can make the difference in the world. So instead of us putting money into buying shares with these big S&P 500 companies, if we can direct just a fraction of that capital to small and medium businesses, that can be catalytic in terms of helping them employ workers, adopt sustainable practices, grow their businesses, we can have a positive impact. So that's why Wholesome, we're not in the business of investing in stock market or property or crypto. We're about allocating capital into small, medium businesses because they are the engines of growth. And that's how we're going to have that sustainable impact. And hence why I started focusing in that space because no one else was really doing it. I was looking
Yeah.
around, who else is doing this? I was like, okay, let me have a go.
You're preaching to a convinced. I think I agreed on the whole speech. I thought it was just what I thought, that you need to build solutions rather to address really the problem. I think it's very important. You mentioned ethical and community values in your speech. How concretely does Wholesome in your portfolio, in your products and services, how do you address this to support these values that you're mentioning?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing is, so we don't invest in companies that have outright ethical, qualms like alcohol, adult entertainment, weapons.
0%? At 0%?
Absolutely. We
Amazing.
cannot invest into any of those companies that work through that. And we work with partners on the ground who themselves uphold and adhere to those values as well. Now, inevitably, when we're not investing in those industries, we're investing into industries that are generally focused on serving society. So, agriculture is a big focus, retail, hospitality, manufacturing, producing goods and products. So, these are the areas that we focus on. So, that's on the, I guess, industry filters. Then, number two is we don't engage in interest because that's also forbidden under Islamic law.
Yes.
And so, what that means is that our contract structures are not your standard interest bearing loans. What are the problems with interest
Okay.
bearing loans? Other than the fact that it can be exploitative because the borrower has to always pay back the lender, and the lender is guaranteed a return. So, that cannot happen. Number two, it means that the borrower is not taking cash, they're actually procuring assets or products. So all investments have to be asset backed in that regard. Number three, if the obligor or the borrower who is securing
Okay.
financing, if they have any payment challenges, you cannot go and compound interest and say, oh, yeah, well, you missed the payment. Now you're going to pay even more because you're not only you're paying back your original principal, but you're paying that outstanding liability for the
Yeah.
interest that you are owing. We cannot have that. So that means we share risk. And this is something that we experienced in the trial phase with Wholesome, because prior to launching Wholesome, we tested this investment strategy with our own money, my shareholders, my team members. We did have some losses, and the losses came in the form of write offs because we couldn't collect on the debt, but also if a business doesn't pay us, let's say they were meant to pay this month and they paid us not this month, but maybe 3 months later,
Yeah.
that's a loss not on the principal, but it's a loss on the yield. Because if we, for example, were meant to earn, say, 10% a year and
Yeah.
paid over 1 year, if they instead pay over 1.5 years, that means now our return has dropped because technically on an annualized basis, we're getting that 10% spread over 1.5 years, right?
Yeah.
So we absorb that loss, but we're still trying to get our payment back, but we absorb a loss in the overall net return. And so this is part of the risk of this investment strategy. But here's the thing that people don't realize, that if when we invest into these emerging markets, usually two things happen. One is we invest in many different businesses across many different industries so that we are not concentrating risk in one industry or another. So if my agriculture investments aren't doing great, my manufacturing businesses are doing okay, or my services business are doing okay. And so they offset that loss that I might be experiencing. Number one. Number two, when I invest into many different businesses, I might have risk with one or two, but then when I have other businesses that are doing well, I can mitigate the risk by offsetting that profile. And lastly, often the investment return already builds in a loss buffer. And so I can absorb that. And I'm okay with that. If I don't get 12% return and I have 10% return, that's great. It's not a problem.
That's your
And we don't need to stress about that. And again, remembering what I'm trying to solve for my clients, they just want me to beat inflation. They want my asset value to be stable, and they want a regular income. If that
yeah.
income means that 1 month it's 7% annualized, another month it's 10% annualized, they're okay with that. And so
Yeah.
that's something that's important for us and why we've chosen this particular product and ultimately how we manage our risk.
When I was at the point of inviting you, I went on Wholesome's website and I saw the returns because we're talking about returns here. I think that's the most important aspect of halal investment. I saw the returns. I was quite impressed of the returns that you guys achieved. So, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
But also during the economic downturns.
Mhm.
So, let's say, for instance, the COVID-19 epidemic.
Yep.
I've seen that you managed to keep your boat afloat and you are still
Yes.
delivering on the returns.
Yes.
How did you go through this period? How did you manage to structure your portfolios and keep your vision to deliver results for your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, COVID did have an impact. Essentially, the way COVID had an impact is a lot of countries had shutdowns for a long period of time. If I
Yeah,
give you an example, in Indonesia, we had businesses that we invested in weren't able to operate. If those businesses cannot operate, they cannot generate revenue and hence they cannot make any payments. So what happened was our yield was affected. The businesses paid back later than they would otherwise have,
yeah,
but they still paid back. And so our principal was intact, but our yield was lower than before. And this is how we are able to maintain a still valuable investment strategy. Because if, for example, we had invested only in stock market, and during that period people were essentially, the market dropped and it took some time for it
yeah,
to rise back, we would have been affected in a similar way. But in our case, it's a debt finance. So the principal, you don't write it off, you don't reduce it, you just wait until you can collect it. It's only when the business is unable to pay for a very long period of time, so let's say 6 months, that's when you write it off. So we were able to maintain that very well. And what we just did was we waited for the people to repay, and then we generated profit and we just started our reinvestment cycle. It's the same thing we do with any other economic downturn. We just basically invest into countries and companies that don't necessarily follow the US stock market or the European stock market. The thing I'll say is these businesses have a high incentive to repay because they are not able to typically borrow from banks. This is that missing middle. Banks and other traditional institutions do not invest into this sector. They have a strong incentive to repay. And this is why we continue to work with them.
I suppose there is a metric that you follow. I wouldn't know the precise name of the KPI, but like the withdrawal amount that your clients go, for instance, if, for instance, during COVID, we know that it's not only the halal investment space. Okay, so people no judgment, but people might have withdrawn some funds out of panicking. So I suppose you follow that type of KPI. I don't know what's the correct name. How do you monitor this, and how are you looking for forward to improve this, tackle
Yes,
this?
absolutely. So during COVID, we had a lock-in period that was longer than what we do in our current funds. We had a lock-in period of typically 12 months during the COVID period. Now our fund is 6 months. How do we manage those shocks now if people do want to redeem? Well, the first thing is that we have a liquidity buffer, which is typically kept in either cash form or kept into cash like instruments where we can redeem less than a month. And our processing cycle is monthly, so that will absorb that feature. The other thing is that we are investing into a lot of businesses that actually pay profits on a monthly, at what late maybe a quarterly basis. And so we
Okay.
are getting a lot of cash flow from those investments in terms of profits, which give us additional cash flow. And worst case scenario, what we might do is request an investor, and this is permitted under information memorandum, that not able to pay out the redemptions this month, but we will stagger the payments over a few months. So if someone wanted to withdraw in this month, instead we pay a little bit this month, a little bit next month, and so forth. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
mechanisms as a fund manager that we deploy to be able to cover that. Now, of course, if everyone wants to withdraw their funds in one, then it becomes a bit more of a challenge. But again, that is not usually the case because we have a lot of investors, some investors who are short-term investors, some who are longer-term investors. And so the job of us as a portfolio manager is to manage that overall mix of who are my clients, what are their timelines, and what are my investments and what are their timelines. And so we balance the two considerations together to make sure that we don't have that kind of problem.
It's it's amazing to listen to you. Honestly, I don't even know if you realize, because sometimes when we have the knowledge and we try to convey it, we don't even realize we have it in the first place. But it's very clear when you talk. I wanted to say, Tanvir, that certain halal investment firms are eligible to, for instance, tax free from the government. For instance, in Canada, they have RSSP, TFSA. In France, we have certain vehicles from the government which allow you to deposit the money. And then after 7 years, you're deducted from taxes because you have kept that money invested somehow.
Hmm.
Are you eligible to like those type of vehicles from the government in Australia, elsewhere? And if yes, tell me about it. If no, are you targeting those
Yeah,
platforms?
I recently came across and learnt about that on a trip to North America. So the shorter answer is I'm not sure if we are eligible for that at the moment. We'll need to do some more research and understand because we don't have a similar thing in Australia. We have
Oh,
definitely tax efficient structures so people can invest into their pensions, which is known as superannuation, and they get certain lower tax brackets. There are of course public and ancillary funds. There are tax free structures where people, if they want to invest either a non-profit structure or they want to set up a bit of an endowment, say like an alcaf structure. So those things do
yeah,
exist. In terms of the specific products that you mentioned in the US and France, I think that we'll need to find out whether our fund is an eligible product on those product lists, because I believe when you use those platforms, they have approved products that you can invest into. So I
exactly.
think so at this stage, I don't have enough information to work out whether we are eligible. It's something that we need to look into further. But certainly in Australia, we do have certain non-profit and also tax efficient structures available for our clients. A lot of them do invest through those pension schemes that I mentioned, like a self-managed super fund. We also have people who invest through family investment trusts, and they have
Yeah.
certain optimization opportunities as well. This is something we're working on because we do get a lot of queries from investors globally, and we're
Hmm.
trying to understand how to best serve them. It's a great point that you mentioned.
Inshallah, this is what's exciting. As a founder in this space, on a daily basis, it must be so challenging. As a founder in general,
Mhm.
but like I think it's so exciting that there are so much things that you could do. I want to juggle between a bit of technical questions, but also like more simple questions that talk to our youth, our community.
Sure.
If I'm someone that wants to get started, I have never invested before.
Mhm.
How would you talk to that person? What are the first few steps that they need to take to
Yeah,
be involved in halal investing?
absolutely. So there's probably three steps I would recommend. The first thing is to create a budget. It's really important that one understands what are the sources of income, what are the major expenses, and then create a part of your budget that you will use for investments and savings. There's a general rule of thumb that most financial planners would say, which is that it's called the 20% rule.
Okay.
Aim to put aside 20% of your income every month towards savings and long-term savings and investments. So if I, for example, was to earn $1,000 in one month, $200 automatically every month, I'm going to put it aside for saving and investment. And I'm going to imagine that I don't have $1,000, I only have $800. And now I'm going to try and make sure that I only spend within $800.
Yeah.
That's all my living expenses. And, when you're budgeting and working out what that 80% is going to be for, you have your absolute basic living costs, like you might have rent, transport, food, groceries, maybe fuel for your car. And you should also put a bit aside for anything that might come up. Maybe you've got to buy gifts for someone. Maybe you're going to have host some guests. Maybe you have an unexpected dental bill that you need to do. So include all of that within your $800. And one of the important things it does is number one, it builds good savings habits. And we know
Yeah.
Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said that consistent
That's-
habits yield the best results. And you're not going to achieve magic overnight. In one month, you're not suddenly going to become a multimillionaire. But that small habit that you start from that first month, it'll compound and compound and compound. With barakah,
Exactly.
inshallah, it'll get there. So that's the first thing. Create a budget. And actually, I didn't make this clear enough, but that means you track your income and expenses month and month. So you observe and give yourself feedback that, okay, did I go out too many times that month? If you're someone who maybe spends a lot of money on coffee, like, well, do I really need three coffees a day? Maybe I can be okay with one coffee and maybe one tea. Whatever it is, I'm just giving an example. But you track that, number one. Number two, create an investment strategy. An investment strategy is not simply, oh, I'm just going to go and invest in property or I'm just going to buy stocks. That's not investment. An investment strategy
Yeah.
is you break down what are my short term and what are my long term goals, and maybe even your medium term goals if you want to get a bit more technical. So, long term goals are what do I really want to achieve in the long term? Think not just 2, 3 years, think 10, 20, 30 years. Really dream big. Maybe you want to set up an endowment for children in your community. Maybe you want to create a conservation area in your village to protect some animals. Maybe you want to support education or refugees, whatever it is. Or maybe you want to look after your grandchildren. You want to make sure if you found that funding your college education was really challenging, you have a commitment that your grandchildren, inshallah, you want to make it easy for them to study. Whatever it is, for your family, for your community, for the globe, set some long term goals. That is going to be your perpetual sadaqah jariyah, which is going to give you rewards in the hereafter. So I'm starting really big and bold. But then you might have
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
goals if I move back in time. Maybe you want to
Yeah.
retire early. Maybe you want to reduce your work and be committed to learning and travel or doing more community work. That means you want to say, okay, by the time I'm 45, I don't want to work full time anymore. I only want to work part time because I still want to be involved, but I want to do some more volunteering or I want to spend more time in da'wah or learning. That requires you to set an investment goal for these long term objectives. And then, even more in the short term, you might say, I want to buy a house, I want to buy a car. So, what I'm saying is, each of these investment objectives require planning and that require you
Yeah.
to think about what am I going to invest in? How is that investment going to satisfy that purpose? If I want to save for a deposit to buy a house, let's say that the house is $1 million and the deposit 200,000. And say I want to buy a house in the next 3 to 5 years. That means I need to start investing now to be able to pay for that deposit. I need to identify investments that are going to have a less than 5 year window. So I'm not going to invest in startups with that money because it makes no sense.
Yeah,
Startups rarely liquidate in 5 years. But I'm going to find assets that are going to have a stable value within 5 years. They're going to allow me to liquidate in 5 years, and they're going to give me some accretion, whether it be through passive income or to growth, to be able to satisfy that. So you follow,
mm-mm-mm.
this is how that strategy
Yeah,
is. Now, for my long term goal, that's 30, 40, 50 years, it's not going to be the same investments because A, I don't need to think short term. B, I can take more risks because there might be a fluctuation in the value in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to be better. So maybe I might invest it into in venture capital, private equity, maybe some high risk ETFs because those goals are very long term. Then I'm going to go to the other extreme. Maybe I have an objective that I want to buy a car in 6 months. I'm not going to invest maybe in the stock market even. Maybe I'm going to invest into passive income and some fixed income assets or leave it into an Islamic bank. This is now what I'm showing that I'm setting my investment strategy based on my short and medium and long term goals. Okay. So this is that second point that I mentioned. Set an investment strategy. And then the third thing I'll say is diversify. Put a little bit of investments into different type of assets with different features. Some might
yes,
be I'm going to put it into an Islamic bank. Some might be I'm going to buy some Islamic ETFs with the idea of compounding over time. And then also I might save and deposit and buy a house because property investing can also provide and as a secure investment strategy. Maybe I've
both.
dabbled in those
Yeah,
for a few years. Now I want to take up a little bit more risk. Why? Because I have generated some wealth from my initial investments. I can try something that normal people won't try. For example, I might invest into a private equity fund, which is very
yeah,
risky, or I might invest into a couple of startups, which are even more risky. And then I can build my confidence and my portfolio. And maybe then at that point, I'll be like, hey, you know what? I have enough investments and savings to pay for my normal living expenses. I'm going to go start a business, right? Which is what I did. I
yeah,
built up a bit of my own savings buffer and investment strategy, and I'm actually generating a bit of passive income from that to help me as a founder because I'm not really making much of a salary as a founder. My business is still at the
yeah,
very early stages. So, diversification is going to be really key. And increasingly, as we get comfortable, we start increasing the notch a little bit more and trying new assets and new risky assets. But you wouldn't do that on day one. So there's a graduation or a evolution in our investment strategies. And the last thing I'll say is those three steps, creating a budget, an investment strategy, and then diversifying,
yeah,
you will continuously revisit those practices and habits every couple of years. And that's the feedback cycle. You learn from your mistakes. Your circumstances change. Maybe you need to take care of more people. Maybe you might need to relocate to a new country, and that will create some changes in your financing, budgeting, and investing habits. So don't be stubborn about it. Learn, read books, speak to other investors, monitor your situation, and constantly evolve. And inshallah, then you will have a robust and very well planned strategy.
inshallah. And I just want to say this is a little caution advice for my community, the Ummah in general. Past performance is not a guarantee of future performance in finance, so that people don't get too hyped up about historical data.
And actually,
First,
one more thing we should say is this
one,
is all general commentary. We're not giving any specific financial advice.
uh, thank you, Tanvir. I actually thought while you were talking this whole time during this whole podcast, I was like, "Man, I forgot to put this in the beginning, but I was
Yes,
actually going to do it. I
yes,
was obliged to do it either way.
absolutely.
So, first, I'm gonna make a clip out of this because I think for the youth, it was very clear. I think it could be very inspiring, even for active professionals. Some of them are not as familiar with investment as others, so I think it could be very interesting. I wanted
The
to
main
ask,
thing is
well,
to get started. I think that starting small and building a positive habit is the best way to go about it.
it's the best way to go. And I wanted to ask just one last question on the technical side, and then just a couple of last questions on your entrepreneurial journey. We talked about the halal investing space at the beginning, that it was not just limited to halal because of the nature of Islamic finance. And that's the beauty of Islam. Alhamdulillah, that actually now people realize, and this is the beauty of Islam. The book gives us rules, and then thousands of years later, like centuries and centuries, people realize, oh, but there was a wisdom in this.
Yes.
And for instance, now with ESG investing, and for instance, CSR being a big topic, especially in Europe, Europe
Mm,
is very fond of CSR. I
absolutely.
think that they're leading the way in CSR.
Hmm.
I think you're already targeting customers, maybe big companies that can also be interested in like those finances because they interested in green finance, social finance, etc. So, what's the target here on them? Is it actually now already a big part of your clients? Are you looking up to those clients to grow even further? And also because we discussed about in the halal community, you have a lot of work. It's type of a long objective because you have a lot of culture change that you have to do in our community in terms of mindset.
Hmm.
So maybe
Hmm.
you're already targeting also those ESG type of investment. So what's the focus on that? What's the strategy on this? I would be very interested.
Yeah, absolutely. This is important not just because it's a theme and customers care about it, but it's a responsibility for us that we need to constantly consider the short term and long term implications of all the things that we do. Now, what we face is that if we apply the Sharia filters and then we apply the ESG and sustainability filters,
Yeah.
we really shrink the investable universe, as they call it. So
Okay.
it makes it very challenging as a fund manager to find these good investments to do. But the good thing is that we're focusing in the private credit space with small, medium businesses, and we obviously filter unethical industries. And so we're already working with, I guess, businesses that are avoiding a lot of harmful activities. And then our sort of theory of change is that we want to support small and medium businesses because they employ people, they create innovation, and they are the catalyst for economic change and growth in any country. Our theory of change is very straightforward and very simple in that regard. Now,
Hmm.
what we find is that in terms of investors, there is a mix in terms of what they want. A lot of investors, particularly in the Muslim community, are not very familiar with ESG or sustainable investing. For them,
Yeah.
they're still thinking, I just need a halal investment. So they're like, can you solve that for me? And then I'll think about the next thing. So I must say, most investors in the Muslim community, I haven't quite thought about that yet, but they should, obviously, and based on the values and consideration. It's just because their current pressing kind of need is, I just need a halal investment with a good return.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's something I observe in terms of the customer base. In terms of the businesses we're investing into, the vast majority of businesses that need financing and they don't often get it from other sources, and which is where the place space that we play in, they are mainly agriculture, retail, some manufacturing. So they generally are not in any sort of industry that's causing any harm per se. But I would say that we do still have some exposure with industries that have an affiliation with oil and gas. And this is something that we hope to further move away from as
Yeah.
we get a little bit larger and can investments more directly. Obviously, there's nothing haram about investing in those assets, but I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
something that is a work in progress for us because we don't want to encourage more oil and gas. It still has a role to play in the energy mix for many countries, especially in emerging countries. So I would say that we are still, it's still a work in progress. It's not something we've solved. And it's, as a new fund manager, we need to balance between obviously finding good investments with those industries. But I would say definitely at the very minimum, we're avoiding the harmful investments that are not compliant with Sharia and obviously interest bearing transactions. But
Hmm.
what I would like to do more of is, yeah, move away from any oil and gas exposure, even direct or indirect. And the second thing is, I want to then be a bit more what I would say positive filtering. So I want to support businesses that are directly doing things like in education or healthcare or green agriculture and be more what I would say impact investing. So impact investing is even higher to me. So if you think about responsible ESG is on the spectrum, and at the
Okay.
highest end of that is only investing companies that are generating revenue from doing positive things. And so it's an evolving space for us.
I was not aware of this. And I think it's very interesting because while you were reflecting on these problems, I thought actually your country, so Tanvir is from Australia, the Australian government has the same problem because mining is a huge part of your economy
Hmm.
and they're trying to diversify, but they're also obliged to cope with mining even though they don't like it. So
Yeah,
it was very interesting.
absolutely.
I had the last question, Tanvir, because I know that you're very busy and I appreciate so much your time. It's that the entrepreneur journey is so hard, and I think there are so many obstacles along the way. I don't think even us realize how
Mm.
much it takes to be an entrepreneur. It takes so much courage on a daily basis, and it takes so much resilience to overcome each time the challenge because you don't have a choice. You just have to deal with it and try to find a solution. What are some significant lessons that you've learned along the way in this journey?
Yes,
This is a tough question.
look, it's entrepreneurship is not for the faint-hearted, for sure. There are challenges across your own mental health and well-being, family time, and being able to be present with your family. And you're constantly having to be your biggest advocate, whether it be to customers, to partners, to stakeholders. And that means being able to deal with a lot of failure because you're not going to win everything. You're going to have rejections. You're going to have customers who don't perhaps take up your product, or even if they do, they sometimes give you a hard time. So it's all part of it. I think, though, one important thing is to be resolutely and absolutely committed to a mission. And the mission is not, I want to make money, I want to be famous, I want to have a
Yeah,
lot
yeah,
of staff and have a big office. It's nothing material. It's really something ephemeral, something that's transcendental across time and place, which is something about a product or a customer, or the change you want to see in the world, if we use Gandhi's sort of phrase.
yeah.
For me, I really enjoy talking to my customers and helping them solve their investment needs. And if I can make a difference, whether it be someone who's starting out or someone who's a very sophisticated investor, and solve a part of their problem, helping someone buy a house, helping someone diversify their risk in their portfolio, helping someone do something with their money and not lose value because it's sitting there and
Yeah.
against inflation, or it's not earning anything in the bank because there's no Islamic option. Those are the things that really motivate me. The second thing is that I think I still battle with this a lot, which is I take a lot of rejection and some of the challenges to heart. I think we need
Which
to
is
be
normal.
absolutely, and I think it's part of having to be able to forgive yourself and be kind to yourself. I'm not able to attend 100% to every single demand that comes my way. And sometimes the applications that I submit aren't as best as I want it to be, or a customer interaction doesn't go the way I want it to be. But I can't let that slow me down, because I have to get up the next day and just treat every day as a fresh new day. So that's really important. The third thing I will say is that, and this is something I'm learning more and more about, is my family and my support circle, my friends, my mentors. I need to really be grateful and really invest in making sure that they're looked after, and I'm present with them. Because if I don't have my family around me, if I don't have my friends and my mentors, then there's no me. And if there's no me, there's no business and entrepreneurship, and none of anything else that I've built.
Yeah.
And so I need to give them my due just as much as I give my due to my business and what I'm working on. And that's something that I'm learning a lot more about, particularly now that I'm a young father. I started my business in January, and then I had my firstborn, Suleiman. He's now 7 months. He was born in
Mabruk.
March. Jazakallah khair. I've got him. I've got my wife who's going through postpartum, and I didn't realize how important they are to my journey, and that they deserve a lot more. And I'm probably not doing enough, and I need to do more. One of the founders of Airbnb, Joe Gebbia, in his book, he talks about. He said he didn't want to become the seventh startup founder,
No,
and that was because he said that he really wanted to make sure he had a very clear boundaries between work and family. And I think that that's really important. So that's something that I'm taking some lessons from and wanting to continue to build further on.
I think, and I really hope that the audience gets like just see the behavior. If I was just inviting a finance startup, a fintech here, And here in a Halal investment founder, we can see how he responded. I just hope that if the products and services did not convince you, and I hope they do, just the minds and the behavior our brother is exposing, we can only wish him the best. Inshallah, I would pray for you and we'll make dua for you that you can go so far because we need people like you in our community. You guys are leading the way, you know. It takes so much courage to do what you guys do, and I hope people respect it. And even I hope they are convinced by the solutions you're offering because there's a lot of value into it. And if not, it's free to just be here and feedback you and say, hey, brother, I wish you the best in this journey. I think we need this in our community. We need to encourage this 100%.
No, Jazakumullah khair. You're very kind. You're giving me far more credit than I'm due. I am really able to do what I am because I have great shareholders who backed my idea to start the company. I have good mentors and I've a very supportive family. This would not be possible without any of those people. And second of all is, yeah, I'd encourage any of your audience members to follow us, myself on LinkedIn, our Wholesome page. And if they want, they can join up to our mailing list to get updates and to read our articles and content. And I really welcome anyone in your community to reach out if there's a way we can support them or collaborate. This is a global effort and we all need to work together.
All relevant links will be put in the description. Jazakallahu khairan Tanvir, and assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.